Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and today we're going to be talking about how armour can affect your fighting style. Now, those of you who watched my previous video will know that I've just made some armour that's perfect for helping to demonstrate this. So, here's my helmet. Whoops! My hand slipped.
I'm dangerous.
Huh. Seems to have suddenly upgraded itself when my hand slipped. So yes, I've given it an upgrade, including a bit of an expansion and some extra rivets and, of course, copper decorations for extra effect. So, back to business. In terms of how the armour affects your fighting style, well, firstly I should caveat and mention that there are different types of equipment to what I'm holding today, but the concepts will still apply in general. So basically, in sort of representations in movies and video games and things, representations of armour tend to vary somewhat, and books and various media formats that are very inaccurate, and that's not to be much of a surprise because they are there for entertainment, not for education in most cases, although there are documentaries and things that sometimes have this same problem as well, slightly. But in terms of the armour, it's usually represented as though it's, in something like video games, it's like an overall sort of reduction how much injury you take, a sort of across the whole board, especially in games that don't represent sort of different areas of armour and all of that. And then in things like TV, armour's usually paper mache and might as well not even exist. And in things like books, I think it's closer to sort of TV and film. But it's very important to note that, I've made this helmet, and I've also made this sword, and this Langsax is spring steel. It's a fully, it's a hardened, tempered, real sword. I've used it in a previous video and showed and demonstrated that yes, it is a sword, it's real. But I tell you now, if I tried to use this sword against this helmet, either I'd gradually I'd make sort of bites and scratches with the edge into the helmet, or before there was any particularly significant damage, I'd wager that the sword would lose and just snap in half. So really, armour is more like, in a lot of cases, especially when we're talking about hard steel or even sometimes things like horn or wood armour in rare cases as well, they actually provide immunity. And that should be said right off the bat. Armour is, at times, a reduction in different types of injuries, but in many ways it is, up to a certain point, an immunity. So when I've got something like this mail shirt that I've got on now, that's obviously, that chainmail has a good resistance against cutting. So if I was to take this blade, in fact here it is, it's sharp. I don't have anything to demonstrate on the sharpness, but you'll have to take my word for it. But if I draw it across the body, oh no, I'm gutting myself. You wouldn't see that normally on TV, but yes. I hope you're satisfied. Oh, I've probably dulled it a bit now. I hope you're satisfied that yes, that was some real draw cutting, and it does nothing. So if I was to look at the sharp force trauma, the type of cutting, especially slicing injuries, I'll start with that. Slicing that happens with knives, swords, edges of spears, various items, that sort of action that is most exaggerated in a draw cut. A draw cut would be if I was fighting against someone and I'd actually got into close play and then I'd put the blade onto somewhere like the neck and then I just drew along. That type of slicing, there's no kind of force behind it, you're just using the edge and drawing along. It's like cutting vegetables. Some people might, yes, chop something, but you can find with a sharp enough knife you just place the blade, smoothly draw it along, and that fine slicing happens. But not with armour. Of course, even things like thick cloth can to some degree help against this, but things like steel armour will help even more. So we're looking at a person like myself who's wearing a shirt of mail. So now, if someone was to try something, various actions. We were fighting, and then there's a parry, and then I draw the blade along. This is one that I've done against someone in historical European martial arts. That was with a two-handed sword, so forgive, this is obviously a one-handed sword, but I was in Iron Door. He then tried to feign an attack from his right, then went around for an attack on his left. I then parried the blow, and then performed a cutting action across the body. Now, that was a nice attack. You know, it was good. That's why I'm kind of happy about it, that it went well. But if that happened against something like a shirt of mail, it would do almost nothing. So there we've already got a situation where we've gone from really good fencing action, something where I've read the opponent's intentions, I've seen their attack come in, I've performed the parry, and I haven't just blocked like an idiot and just stood there. I've set myself up. I now know his blade's position. It's right here. Well, actually, it was higher, I think. It was about here, trying to aim for maybe my shoulder or collarbone area. I then performed the draw cut. There was chopping power. It wasn't a complete placement and draw along, but there was a lot of a slicing motion in it because it is a sword representing a sharp item. So I'm done the parry, cut along with some chopping, mostly slicing of that particular, what I had room to do in that riposte. Like I said, wouldn't work with something like a mail shirt. So yes, I could have done something like taken the parry, and then instead I could have, for the same area, I could have focused, instead of coming across his body and drawing, I now have to change what I'm doing and be more dangerous to myself because the opponent's wearing a shirt of mail. I might, for example, I see he feigns an attack from the right, comes in on his left, I then take the parry, and then instead of drawing the blade along the body while I come out away from his blade, which is safe, so I've attacked in a way where I've made myself safe and have performed a wounding action on my opponent. If he was wearing something like a shirt of mail, and for some reason I decided I am going to hit in that spot, I would have to either choose to thrust, which is fine, or if I was trying some sort of cut, I would need to deliver more of a chopping power and hope that I bite through the rings in a mail. And from what I've experienced so far of, chainmail destruction, although I've only so far cut and chopped, and shot and various things against butted mail, that usually would make the rings open up and fall down. For the most part, it doesn't seem like it's so easy to sort of cut through. You can't so easily hew the entire rings themselves apart. You usually got to open them up at the weak point, like the rivet, or if it's crap butted mail, it just sort of opens up almost on its own. So against real mail armour like this, which has riveted rings, which most of the historical European armour anyway has, I need to chop quite violently, so I can no longer safely come across the body and perform a slicing action outwards. I need to be smart about it. So I could, for example, take that parry, and then I'm looking at the draw cut, but I need to spend a bit more time and put myself in a bit more danger, or just be that good and accurate, where I'm placing a similar draw cut, but no longer across the belly. Well, it was, I think, the lower, it was something like the abdomen or lower rib cage area that I got him. But I'd have to deliberately aim for the neck. So that's an unarmoured part. If you look at a person like myself right now, wearing a segmented helmet with mail aventail, and then, of course, next to it, the shirt of mail, there is a weak point here. There's clearly an opening in the face and neck. So I could come to the neck and draw out in a similar way to how I did it, but I need to be more accurate. So what if I miss? If I was a bit too high, I'm catching the nose of the helmet. If I'm a bit too low, I'm catching the shirt of mail. And again, if it was a draw cut, I've gone from doing a beautiful wounding action to doing almost nothing. This is a real problem fighting against someone in armour. So, in terms of other types of injuries, of course, when it comes to things like blunt force trauma, most people know that padding helps a lot. So yeah, something like a shirt of mail isn't going to help much. Well, it can help in a deflective sense, very good for deflecting blows. So something like a glancing hit is not too bad. And that's one of the good things about learning to sword fight, learning to fight with weapons in general, in armour or out of armour. If you have attempted to avert an attack, your armour can save you. That's another way, because you could have something that would be more of a glancing blow. It could be with a mace, it could be with an axe, it could be with a spear, a sword, various items. They've performed a wounding action, and a sharp edge or a good force of whack or something like that will start to make purchase on the body. And if I take that hit, even if maybe I've partially parried it, but they've crushed through it slightly, I didn't prepare in time, or they've gone on the foible of the sword and they've started coming through it, then we're in a situation where without armour at all, it's less of a wounding action, but I'm still getting quite badly hurt. And I've done fencing, I felt it through the protective gear, and I think if that was with a sharp blade, I wouldn't be very happy right now, even though it would be less than if I completely failed to defend myself. However, with the armour, that can then go from being a sort of a lessened wound, to that glancing blow just being deflected away. You can have a situation where you have something that would be quite injurious and not only reduce it, but completely mitigate it. And indeed, that's one of the things that's useful in terms of also changing the way that you fight. So you can deliberately exploit your armour. That's my third point. You can exploit your own armour to actually make yourself fight better. So let's say I'm using this type of system I've got now. So I've got a mail shirt. I'm going to use these as an example each time, but you can see the equivalence. Shirt of mail, hard helmet, and I've got a sword and a shield. This particular shield is not like a Saxon or Viking style, it's a Taj, which is more of a later Scottish version, but still, you get the idea of how these sorts of items work. So I could be fighting with someone, I'm trying to do all sorts of things, I'm seeing where I can get purchase, and then we come up with a situation where I feel like my opponent is going to strike, maybe they'll strike high, down to try and split my head open. I'm wearing a helmet, that's good. Now what if they were pretending to attack my head? They're sort of pretending to go in, and then they're going to turn it into some sort of horizontal cut or something. If I'm unarmoured, I'll probably guard my head, and then I'll try to keep watch, before my riposte, which is what's called a single-time defence. Those of you who don't know, two-time defence, parry, hit, single-time defence, parry, hit at the same time. So anyway, trying that, I could be, say, trying to go in, get that thrust as I'm guarding my head with the shield, and then if they actually were cutting horizontally, that feigned attack, maybe I'll have to adjust my shield, hope I've got quick enough reactions, maybe I move out of the way, or maybe I'm adjusting and put the sword in the way, or, let's say they're attacking outside of the shield, so then I'm parrying of the sword instead because they've attacked this side, things like that, because I don't want that weapon to touch me, because if I'm unarmoured, sharp weapons especially, but also blunt weapons to a degree, if they touch you, you're getting quite badly wounded. I remember in the book, I think it's called Swordsmen of the British Empire, talks about accounts of people who were in real sword fights, much later than the stuff I'm talking about where, there wasn't as much armour involved. Sometimes there were bits of armour involved with certain factions, but it certainly describes that there are people who've, taken wounds in various fashions, even from what might have been more like glancing hits and certain things like failed parries mentioned earlier. So I don't want the weapon to touch me. Because even people who've survived, they've been the winner of something like a fight with swords, but they, let's say, took a bad wound to the arm later, and then they found that later in life they're struggling to perform tasks like writing and other things. They've taken a permanent injury. They're a winner in a sense, but they've still taken a lot of punishment in the process. But, of course, with armour, now we've got a situation where my arms in this configuration are still unarmoured, but I can adapt to this. So, we're talking about the opponent who for some reason wants to bear down on me. I could decide, in case they're maybe bearing in and shooting forwards, I can keep my shield lower. So now I've just got this helmet, the actual steel helmet here, which is above my shield. I can look slightly over it, and I can perform my riposte at the same time. But notice I can keep the shield lower, because if someone hit over the shield, they're hitting a helmet. I might get a concussion. This is a problem with most armour. I've never heard of a helmet that stops a concussion. If you get hit hard enough, it's just a thing that happens. It'd be great if something was invented that stopped them, but until the year 3000, where such things exist, you get a big hit on the head, you get a concussion. It's just one of those things. But still, better than dying, and also more recoverable than a wound that actually comes, starts going deeply in. So I can be taking that injury, that's potentially minor injury, or if they're focusing more on the cutting power, perhaps not take any injury at all, and perform that thrust or cut as the riposte. No problems. So we're in a situation where I've exploited my armour, and I've used, in this case, the helmet to deliberately take the hit, and then I've just covered over areas that are unprotected. You also see this with medieval knights, especially in the late medieval period, when you've got things like brigandine armour. So there they have a shirt of mail sometimes, or maybe what are called voiders, which are bits of chainmail in places like the armpits. And then I'll have, of course, a steel helmet. A lot of treatises and depictions seem to suggest that people would lift their visor when they're in close combat, so their face might be exposed to a degree. But you've got most areas armoured, head to toe, and then you've only got specific weak spots, which are in areas which cannot be protected by hard armour, like inside the elbow, because if you're moving your arm this way, you can't have a big plate in a way stopping you. Same with the armpits, in the groin, sometimes in the neck, depending on the type of armour. Certainly in the visor of the eye socket of the visor, if the visor's down, or of course more generally the face if the visor's up. Sometimes I've heard in a cuff of the gauntlet, but I struggle to imagine exactly how that can be utilised in a fight unless you're at grappling range, but still something to consider. So I could be a knight who's fighting in heavy armour, and then I can exploit my armour and make sure to allow myself to be hit. It's a weird thing, and it might almost seem like some kind of dumb brute kind of mentality, but it is a genuine tactic. It's an intelligent thing to do. The armour is there for a purpose, and by doing what looks like a dangerous action and seeming to be kind of gung-ho and just charge in, you can actually give yourself an advantage, because at that point, if you're up against, say, an unarmoured peasant who's trying to just, chop you down with an axe or spear you through or something like that, I could decide, well, I don't want to be jabbed at, here's a spear, jab, 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 and then eventually they make purchase through the eye socket, die like Harold Godwinson, although he died by an arrow, but still piercing through the eye. So instead, I think, okay, I'm up against a spearman, they're jabbing at me, they might get something, I might get stabbed in the inside the elbow, they might find an angle to catch me in the armpit, they might well find a way under the skirt of the armour and then catch into the groin. There's certainly a real threat around the eyes if the visor's down, or the full face if it's open. So, there's a good chance they're going to stab me. Surprise, that's what spears do. But if I charge someone, surprise, if I'm back here and I'm giving them plenty of time to aim, I've only got a sword for whatever reason. Medieval knights did like swords actually quite a bit, because good for things like half-swording. So they could be there, the person spears in, and if I'm staying at a distance, not really doing anything, they can jab, and got the armour, out of range, parried, all this, and then, killed. That's not a very good idea, but I could decide, you know what, if I pressure them, if I charge in, seeming like a mad brute, they'll probably just kind of go, ugh, they'll have a reaction, and they'll instinctively thrust. And they won't do it very accurately, because, when people are kind of panicked or they're just kind of improvising, they've got a lot less focus and a lot less precision. That's a good thing if you've got lots of armour, because one of the things that is very important when you're fighting against armour is having that precision, finding those gaps, finding the areas where there isn't protection, getting that murder in an area where it's almost as if they're not wearing armour at all. But if you've panicked them and they just instinctively, I'm charging in, maybe I failed the parry, I'm trying to half sword and take the spear aside, I failed and they stabbed me in the belly. But that's okay because I'm wearing a breastplate. So they stabbed me in the belly. Maybe I'm feeling a bit of pressure, but I know where the point is. And one of the things that I should mention, especially if you are not yourself an experienced fencer, if you've got contact with your opponent's weapon, you know where it is, and you're much more likely to control it. So normally, this is taught in unarmoured fencing that you should take their weapon on your weapon or on the shield. But hey, if you're a knight in heavy armour, why not improvise and have that contact be, there's a spear in my belly, but it's okay because it's not killing me, it's just making a little annoying dent or, making a little sort of scratch in the breastplate. You'll either get stuck slightly, because often weapons are harder steel than the armour, depends, variable, but still. Or if not, it's glanced off. If it's glanced off, great, it's to my side, I charge in and stab them in the face. If it gets stuck into the armour a little bit, I go, oh, well, I've got some contact. Let's push you aside and then stab you in the face. So here we've got a situation where instead of having to play this very complicated fencing game, where will they stab? How do I close distance? Can I gain control of their spear? Oh, they've disengaged. Maybe I can try with different actions. Maybe I can try to feint, but oh wait, no, I can't feint because I'm too far away and they know I can't hit them, so it's not convincing them. Damn, what do I do? Maybe I could bring in, something like a shield, an extra weapon, pick up a stick off the ground, some sort of improvisation and do all these things and then finally get in, because spears are really difficult to deal with because they've got this kill zone. I had another fencer call, not specifically spears, but when they actually are referring to an opponent is taller than you, but they called it the donut of death. This little ring around a person where they can hit you, but you can't hit them. And it's wonderful for the person who's got the extra reach because they're tall or because they've got a longer reach weapon. Not so good for you because all of this time spent in that donut of death, if you try to look convincing and aggressive, it doesn't work. Not unless they're a complete beginner and don't know what the hell they're doing. But anyone with even a tiny amount of training understands that, like if I'm aiming at you in the camera now, surprise, this weapon is not reaching you. I need to close distance and actually be at a measure where I can hit. Because the entire time outside that range, I'm just wafting a weapon at the air. Very fancy, very pretty, try juggling. So we've got a situation where using armour can help with things like closing distance. It's one of the reasons why it seems like knights preferred closer range weapons. You've got things like the longsword, which is a two-handed blade, and they'll do things like half-swording, so that's interesting. They've got a weapon which can reach further. It's got a two-hand grip, a fairly long blade, and yet they choose to grip the blade about a half to two-thirds up and then close in. This is shown explicitly in many treatises, and it's very important to note that it occurs more frequently when depicted in armoured fighting. Take, for example, Fiore di Liberi. You've got different stances which are unarmoured, so I can have, for example, I mentioned the iron door. So I'm back here, the sword's fairly low, I'm relaxed, but I'm ready to do something like attack or defend as I need to. I can do various actions. I could be in something like guard a lady, which is back here. It's almost like I'm swinging a baseball bat. Can be done on non-dominant side or dominant side. And things like window, so up here, point towards the opponent. You sometimes see it on TV, but people don't know what the hell to do with it. Stuff like that. But with things like armoured fencing, people are usually starting off here, which is an equivalent of the iron door, but I'm using a sword in half sword because I want to be ready to stab like a spear and deflect around with the sword acting as a sort of an iron bar. And that's interesting because it demonstrates how confident they are on the armour. Nobody, and I'll say nobody, wants to reduce their effective range unless they are confident that they won't be murdered on the way in. So that's a situation, or unless it's a desperate situation. I mean, you look at the, I think it was the Jacobites, who had Highland broadsword and Taj, often against people trained in muskets. But that's a slight side note. But yeah, usually people are shortening their range deliberately if they're expecting that they'll be able to get close. So if you're up against something like a spear, or you're up against a halberd, glaive, bill, all of these different types of weapons, if I'm doing that unarmoured, oh boy, that's going to be hell. But in armour, yeah, watch out for concussions, watch out for, of course, people getting purchased into the gaps in the armour, but it's much safer, and I mean much safer. And it's also interesting as well how the different types of armour will affect your protection. So, for example, I've got this shirt of mail. Mail armour can be quite heavy, but it's quite flexible. So the way that I fight, and I've done some sparring actually in a mail shirt, in fact there was even a video recorded when I was doing some arming sword against someone and I was wearing a shirt of mail that time. Doing that, I'm actually in a situation where I'm fighting in a way as though I'm unarmoured. I move in the same way. It's quite good that this is, although previously it might have been called a hauberk and all these types of things, but we nowadays call it a shirt of mail. And that's fair, because it really does move like a shirt. And same like chausses, they move a lot like trousers, and things like a coif, a hood of mail, it moves around like your normal head. There's no real restriction. So the way that you can move is identical to if you're moving without armour. But the difference is, it's like you've gained some weight. So there's that extra momentum that pulls you across. If you, for example, dash or sprint, or if you're making evasive manoeuvres or you're closing in, there's kind of an extra momentum. It's almost like it's a momentum, and it kind of pulls you. But apart from that weight and that pull that sort of carries you further in the direction that you're initially going, not much changes in terms of your fighting style. With hard armour, something like this helmet, not really much difference. Something like, of course, a closed visor, that I'm going to have a lot of problems seeing, and I need to very much focus to try and see my opponent through those gaps. That's again why I think it does make sense to do something like lift the visor, have that clear, open view, because I want to be aware of my surroundings and what's coming in to try and kill me, especially things like pole axes, maces, and other items that are blunt weapons that can cause nasty injuries behind the armour. Not as severe as out of armour, and certainly less fatal. And it's interesting that it seems like when I've looked at depictions, entries, admittedly relying a little bit too heavily for my comfort on Wikipedia, but it's suggesting that in a lot of these sort of time periods where people are fighting with more armour, more people are getting injured. You look at different battles in things like the World Wars, or an earlier sort of the Bronze Age. Obviously, sharp weapons are being used, or projectile weapons are being used, and a lot of people died. But it's interesting that in periods like the 100 Years' War, we've got a lot of people who are being injured or captured instead. And the rate at which people are being captured or wounded is noticeably more, as far as I can tell, than in other time periods. So again, yes, you can be taken out of combat by something like an incoming mace or an incoming poleaxe, but, I mean, you survived. So people say, oh, the armour doesn't work, look, this person still got hurt, oh, it's rubbish. But they didn't die. I need to reiterate this, they didn't die. The armour works. I feel the need to say this, especially when, like I said, all of the various forms of popular media depict armour as crap, but it's not crap, it's good. Just, depending on the circumstances of if you're caught on an unarmoured area, or, if you're up against someone who's using things like I could have a fully armoured knight. If someone shot a cannon, and yes, those did coexist, someone could be in full plate armour, someone shoots a cannon, and, oh, they died, surprise. That's not a fault of the armour, those were some extraordinary circumstances. But looking at fighting and the way that armour affects it, there's also the degree of fighting against armour. So let's remove this for a minute. See my, I was going to say luscious locks, my messy hair. So fighting without armour, against armour, this is an interesting scenario because all of those beautiful advantages that I mentioned earlier are going to now become problems you have to get over. So you're up against a person with good armour on and you've got less armour on. Ah, man. You've got to try and close the distance, but yet, of course, we've got this problem where, like I mentioned earlier, if you try to close distance in a donut of death, a range where they can hit you and you can't hit them, we're in a situation where I've got to quite desperately and frantically parry and cover and do a covered entry. There are ways to do a covered entry. Maybe I should do a video on it in the future, you know, how to basically parry on the way into closing distance and then attack with a blade or attack, you know, in a normal sort of, you know, thrusts, grappling, all these kinds of things. But it's still a situation where you're up against the odds. You've got to first defend, which is a bad situation to be in. They say the best offence is a good defence. I say the best defence is a good offence. You should marry up your parries and your attacks, but if you have to close distance, like for example you need to get into the gaps on a knight, you don't really have that option so much. You do have to do this nasty binary video game style, I block the attack before I give the attack kind of stuff. It becomes a necessary evil to do something like close distance to draw a dagger and stab into the face or catch into those armpits and other areas like that. Because I'm finding, aha, I've got a spear, I've got a sword or something. Chop! The armour's not making anything happen. Nothing's happening. And nothing's happening. And while I could be delivering a not very deadly action to the knight, they could do what's called a double, which in fencing is where both opponents hit each other, both people unarmoured. You know, that's pretty crap. Both of them died, or both of them being badly wounded. But against, when it's unarmoured versus armoured, I died, they didn't. And that's not very fair, is it? Because we could have done the exact identical action. I'm doing this attack, I've got the same kind of weapon, I've done the same kind of attack at the same target, with the same amount of force, and the same amount of sharpness and all these factors, so why am I losing? Because armour's cheating. But that's how warfare works. Mate, you don't play a gamble, you play to win. So, fighting against armour, yes. Using something like a blunt weapon is a good idea. So I think things like pole axes and pole hammers, they were just great for that sort of thing. You see a knight, you've got a hammer that's not massive. It's not like in some video games we've got like a block of stone on the end of a stick. It's, you know, there's reasonable, nimble action, but you're still wanting to go crash down, smack their head, give them a concussion, capture them for later. Thank you very much, Sir Knight. Now I'm going to kill your less armoured friends. So there are ways. You don't have to go inside that donut of death. You don't have to risk your life to close distance, but it's one of the things that may become a necessity in certain circumstances, like if you're armed with shorter weapons. Because you could, for example, have a shield and a mace. You're fighting against, I've only got a hammer right now, but you could be up against an armoured knight and think, well, I've got a mace, and I've got a shield, I can block, I can hit, and then, bang, this is going to work, right? Oh, and the knight's brought in a poleaxe. So now we're in a situation where I've got to parry that poleaxe at a range where I can't hit him, waft, swinging at the air, I've got to parry that, and then maybe as I'm closing in, they might have a chance for another attack, and then I can hit them, and that's an annoying time. So yes, whether you're in the armour, out of the armour, or you've both got armour, fighting in armour really changes things. And I can go into specific techniques, but I feel like there are people who have already done this to a degree on things like half-swording videos, grappling, stuff on grappling, stuff on dagger plays, because there were people who, carry something like a rondel dagger, start with an initial weapon like a spear, poleaxe, sword, these sorts of things, and then they've gotten into a range where they're wrestling of each other, then they've drawn the knife, these sorts of things. But there are other videos that have covered it. I can cover the topic as well if you want, but I thought this should be a good overview of just how armour changes the way you fight. And I hope this gave you some food for thought. And thank you for your time. I hope you liked this new helmet. I'll give you a close-up. Here it is. So I've done some copper rings here. And here we are going round. These are all, the steel rings are riveted. And the copper rings are butted because they're just cosmetic. And that's my cue to leave. See you later. Right, yep. Right, and you got me on the shoulder. Helmet. Right, yeah. There. Right. Shoulder. Yeah. Yeah. Belly. Right. Yeah, late parry, you got me. Upper arm. Yeah. Leg.